Well, hello, everybody, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I am the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center in DC. The focus of our webinar today is the trajectory of the economies of India and Pakistan over their nearly 75 years since independence. That 75-year milestone will be marked later this summer. On some levels, India and Pakistan have shared many economic experiences and challenges up to the present day, including issues like poverty and unemployment. But if you step back and look at the broader growth stories of India and Pakistan, there is a sharp divergence. While Pakistan's growth exceeded that of India's as recently as the late 1980s, India's economy would take off in a big way starting in the 1990s when the government initiated a series of liberalization reforms. Today, India is one of the world's largest economies, while Pakistan has been unable to keep up. Our discussion today will delve into these different economic growth stories. We will compare and contrast each country's economic evolution, identify key policies and turning points, and highlight what each must do to achieve future economic success. And we will also look at how the Indian and Pakistani economic stories have impacted US policy. We've got a great group of distinguished scholars and experts assembled here today to have this discussion. We're joined by Dr. Atif Mian, who currently teaches economics, public policy, and finance at Princeton University. He previously taught at UC Berkeley and the University of Chicago. He's also the founder of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, or CERP. We also have with us Dr. Arvind Subramanian, a senior fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University. He previously taught at Harvard's Kennedy School and Ashoka University in India. He was chief economic advisor to the Indian government between 2014 and 2018. Additionally, we are joined by Ambassador Teresita Schaefer. She is a senior advisor at McLarty Associates. She had a 30-year career in the US Foreign Service that included 11 years spent in South Asia. She served at the US embassies in India and Pakistan, and was ambassador to Sri Lanka, among other postings. She was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East and South Asia. Finally, last but not least, we have with us today Sanjay Kathoria. Sanjay is a colleague. He's a Wilson Center Fellow, focusing on a project on the future of South Asia. He spent over 27 years at the World Bank, working on South Asia and other regions. He also taught at Georgetown, among other places, and was a fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. His work focuses on economic growth and development and trade in South Asia. So he is the perfect person to moderate today's event, and that is what he will do. I'm very grateful to Sanjay for his camaraderie and engagement during his time at the center and for his contributions to our activities, including this event today. Before I turn things over to him, just a logistical note for the audience, for those of you tuning in. After Sanjay moderates a discussion with the speakers, he will take questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org or tweet it to the handle @AsiaProgram. So with that, I'll now sit back and enjoy the show. So Sanjay, I turn things over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you for those kind words. And I appreciate very much being a part of the Wilson Center family. So let me get started straight away on a few introductory remarks. So we know that the 1947 partition of the subcontinent was a grim inheritance. Pakistan got dealt a very tough hand. Imagine how the situation must have been if they had to use thorns for paper clips. Both countries grappled with refugees, especially Pakistan as a proportion, stagnant economies, mutual war in 1948, and a very skeptical world, skeptical about their future. Today, India's per capita income is significantly higher than Pakistan's. In nominal dollar terms, in 2020, India was at $1,928 and Pakistan $1,189. So about a 65% difference. Even in purchasing power parity terms, the difference was not as high, but still high at about 35%. Between 1993 and 2020, Pakistan's growth exceeded 6%, GDP growth exceeded 6% in only 2 years. 2004 and 2005. Over the same period, over the same 28 years, India crossed 6% GDP growth in 18 of those 28 years. And the current situation is sort of symptomatic of that. The World Bank's latest estimate for India's growth for fiscal year 21-22 that just finished is about 8.7%, and Pakistan's is about half that, at 4.3%. But it wasn't always this way, as we all know. It was only in 2007 that India's nominal dollar per capita income crossed Pakistan's, and that gap has been widening ever since. So let me offer some quick initial thoughts on the contrast in similarities in the development experiences of the two countries, some of which I hope our speakers will take up further. I will focus on three issues, although of course there are many, other things to talk about. Let's start with the different role of the armies, right? So one way to look at this is Pakistan got 17% of colonial India's revenue streams, but inherited 33% of the military, right? So twice. This disproportionality is expressed in so many different ways. One is military expenditure, which for Pakistan peaked at 7% of GDP in 86, but is still high at about 4% in 2020. And it has always been higher than India's. India's current GDP expenditure is about less than 3% of GDP in 2020. It peaked at 4.2%. The army in Pakistan, even when not in direct charge of the administration, has an outsized influence on politics and foreign affairs, and also has a rather large economic empire. In India, by contrast, the army has been confined to the barracks, something that India's leaders were quite keen to ensure at the time of independence and were cognizant of this. And you can read a lot more about this from Stephen Wilkinson's superb book. The second issue I want to bring up is crony capitalism. Right? Both Arvind and Atif have written and talked a lot about it. Right? So for Pakistan, the outstanding development economist Mehboob ul Haq talked about the 22 families that he said dominated the economy. And as finance minister over 1985 to 1988, he even tried, but did not succeed in taxing these dominant enterprises, the families and their enterprises. And I note that Atif and Asim Khwaja in a 2005 study found that rents to politically connected firms may cost Pakistan dearly, ranging from between 0.3 to 1.9% of GDP. India has its own version of crony capitalism, which Arvind has talked of as stigmatized capitalism, and which, among other things, perpetuates India's traditional suspicion of the private sector. Right? Now, has India's version of cronyism not penalized its economy as much as Pakistan's? Is it because India is much larger and so harder to dominate? Or it has some other sectors where competition is strong? These are some questions on this subject. And the third and final issue that I want to talk about is trade pessimism, a common feature between India and Pakistan, and indeed amongst all South Asian countries, and South Asia is not just the least integrated region in the world, but it's also the most trade diffident or the most protected region in the world. Tariffs are high in India and Pakistan versus comparators. They are variable across sectors because of special interest groups or because government policies to promote different sectors. And in fact, protection has been increasing in recent years. And there are some, I don't have time to get into statistics, but we can, if you all are interested, we can talk about it later. But the outcomes on trade have been very different and are worth highlighting, right? So trade as a share of GDP, both goods and services, peaked in Pakistan as early as 1993. And this is staggering, that the peak was as early as 93 at 38%. The 2020 ratio is 27%, right? So while the rest of South Asia was, hyper globalizing, as Arvind has called it, Pakistan was dropping. So India rose steadily. India's trade to GDP ratio rose steadily since the mid 1980s, especially after 91. and it peaked at 56% of GDP in 2020. Currently, it's 38%, so which is also a dramatic fall. In India, the protection appears very deliberate, at least in recent years. In Pakistan, apart from the special interest groups, there are also forced measures arising from the foreign exchange scarcity. Right? So I will stop here in terms of my initial remarks, and I have the pleasure to turn to Atif Mia to begin with. Apart from what Michael said, he also wrote co-author of a very important book, House of Debt, along with Amir Sufi. So, Atif, let's start perhaps with a broad question. Right? So, can you explain the growth trajectory of Pakistan over the last 75 years? It seems quite different from the other two large South Asian economies, as I was talking about, and especially after 91. And many have said Pakistan's best years are behind them. Right? Is there a turning point in Pakistan's growth story? What are the explanations for the initial growth spurt and then the subsequent failure to live up to the promise of the early years? So over to you, Atif, perhaps 7 to 8 minutes for this initial round.
Thank you, Sanjay. And of course, thanks, Michael and Wilson Center for having me. You asked, very deep questions. And given the scarcity of time, let me start with the more recent experience. At some level, it might be the most relevant as well as we think about what may happen in the future. If you look at Pakistan's economy over the last 20 to 25 years, as you have rightly pointed out, it has tended to lag further behind its peers like India, Bangladesh, but certainly more broadly, the same is true if you were to compare Pakistan to its peer developing countries. The question I want to start with is, why has that happened? Can we try and do like a structural diagnosis of the problem at hand? So let me start with that. Now, as I think about that question, you want to look at sort of the demand side structure of the economy, and then you want to look at the supply side of the economy. That's sort of the traditional way to go about diagnosing a problem in economics. When you look on the demand side, I'll highlight two facts which I find quite interesting. And that is, first, if you look at, so let me just summarize first of all my point. My point first is going to be that Pakistan is not an average poor country. It deviates from the average poor country like Pakistan in important ways, and I want to highlight that on the demand side. So first of those is that the under 5 mortality rate in Pakistan is much higher relative to its peers. In fact, 20 more under 5 kids die per 1,000 live birth. That's a very high number relative to its peers who are earning the same GDP per capita. Similarly, if you were to look at literacy or on the education side, you'll see the same picture emerge, which is that the literacy rate in Pakistan is 15 percentage points lower than what it typically is for other countries with the same income per capita. And so that's the sort of the first thing that's telling you something, that its demand is highly skewed towards the top of the distribution, and the average or the median, and then certainly the lower middle class is much worse off in Pakistan on these important dimensions. I should just add that we know that poor people care as much about education and health everywhere in the world. We have a lot of evidence on that. So these kind of results are telling you something much deeper, systematic about the country at the macro level, as opposed to anything being wrong at the micro household level, just to be clear on that. Now, why does the situation look like that? I think now let's move to the supply side, and we'll start to see why the picture is the way I just described on sort of the demand or expenditure side. The first most important point on the supply side, in my view, is to look at who controls the supply side. Where does production come from, and so on. And when you look at that, with a couple of things stand out, which is it's first, there's a lot of rent seeking involved in production. But that rent seeking is in a particularly unproductive manner. So, for example, there's a lot of rent seeking in the real estate sector by the political elite. And that's a classic unproductive sector where you take advantage of the rise in land prices, which is by and large driven by aggregate gains in productivity of everyone else in the economy. But because you have access to land in different ways, turning government land into private sector and so on and so forth, you get a very large piece of those effective rents, and then you spend that in a very skewed manner, which then shows up on the demand side. The other example of those kind of rent seeking would be like protected sectors that Sanjay, you mentioned in the beginning as well. Sugar industry would be one example. Auto is another. There are many big sort of industries inside that are protected, not particularly productive. Sugar, it doesn't even make sense given the scarcity of water and all of that. So the agriculture sector has been, on average, unproductive, partly as a result of these kind of irrational subsidies. But the net effect of that is that you have on the supply side this skewed earning capacity, which is driven less by productive sources, and more by unproductive sources. I should just add that every country has elite, and elite everywhere try to do rent seeking. So Pakistan is no different from that perspective. But what I'm trying to highlight is that the elite, the way they have, for whatever reason, extracted those rents is in a particularly unproductive direction. As opposed to, for example, if you were to compare China or Korea or Japan, the elite largely sort of concentrate in the tradable sector. So they take all the advantages to credit and so on, but their activity has more synergies with the rest of the economy because it's in a more productive tradable sector, as opposed to the Pakistani elite that is engaged in rent seeking and in more unproductive sectors. And so that and it's that supply side that adds the negative pressure on the exchange rate as well. Because while they are the sources of demand, including demand for foreign goods, is driven by this relatively unproductive behavior, you don't have the corresponding high productive sectors to sell to the rest of the world. And so that creates this chronic balance of payment issue in Pakistan as well, which is again something you've already highlighted, Sanjay. So I think it's that sort of the supply and the demand side taken together kind of reflect where Pakistan is today. Now, on the supply side, I should add there are a few other. Now, the lack of investment is kind of a direct result of that, which is also very stark. Pakistan's, again, compared to its peers, has a much lower, like 14, 15 percentage points lower rate of investment. And it's a combination of all these factors that then translates into what you just started off with, which is lower growth relative to the rest of the world. There are other issues on the supply side, like very low female labor force participation. And we can talk about sectors. And then the last very important thing is, of course, the violence and terrorism that Pakistan has been plagued with over the last 20 or 25 years. Let me stop here on just sort of the structural diagnosis. You talked about what happened that Pakistan kind of sort of did not live up to its earlier promise. And there are important events happening, of course, in the 70s and then sort of doubling down on those in the 80s that have resulted, in my view, in this sort of the situation that I just described. But let me stop at this point, and we can perhaps take a deeper dive into the historical causes as we move this conversation forward.
Thank you very much, Atif. And I think that obviously very carefully thought out. And I want to just highlight the one common issue on female labor force participation, where India is also having very significant major problems. And indeed, even prior to COVID, it was a major outlier globally on female labor force participation. So it's a good point to actually turn to Arvind. Professor Arvind Subramanian is, of course, people who know him is a prolific writer, policy wonk, and a teacher. Apart from what Michael mentioned, he's also published a book called Of Counsel, The Challenges of the Modi-Jaitley Economy, reflecting, on his years in the government. And then before that, he also wrote a very highly regarded book called Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Economic Dominance. So, Arvind, just like Atif did, can we have a broad brush explanation of India's overall growth trajectory over the last 75 years? What our Professor Raj Krishna initially for the first 30, 40 years used to call the Hindu rate of growth, and then the gradual pickup in the 80s, then the reforms crisis driven, the golden growth period, and then the deceleration after 2011. So what are the key elements in this growth story that you would like to highlight?
Thanks, Sanjay. And like Atif, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me to this terrific panel. Obviously, like Atif said, trying to compress, such a long and rich history into 7-8 minutes. Obviously, I'm going to do a lot of injustice to a lot of things. But let me compliment Atif by starting at the beginning rather than the more recent period, and maybe then we can then with Tezi coming in, we can talk about dive deeper into the thing. So firstly, I think that by definition, this is you've posed this in terms of India, Pakistan, and the divergence. But just because India is today, whatever, 30, 40, 50% richer than Pakistan, doesn't necessarily mean that, by some other objective standard, India's performance has been, spectacular or very bad or whatever. I think we just need to keep that in mind, that, for example, if you compared India with the performance of the East Asians or China, I think, there is a sense in which India would fall short. So I think we need to keep that in mind, when we talk about India and India versus Pakistan. The way I think about this is, there is, and Sanjay, you kind of very nicely put it, there is you said this in terms of the army, but I think, when nations begin, there's an inheritance, there are critical junctures, and critical choices are made at that juncture. And I think, for both India and Pakistan, I think those early decisions were fateful. They were, they created a lot of path dependency. It's not that they remained forever, but some remained, endured for a long time. Some were reversed for all kinds of reasons, some of which I'll touch upon. But I think it's this rich interaction between the inheritance, the early choices, and then, history evolves. You get crises, you have the role of ideas, you have accidents, and then, of course, you have political agency. So all of these things shape the broader trajectory of every country's development, and that was no less true of India. So let me say that at the critical juncture, I think India made some very important and good choices, which have really stood India in very good stead. Democracy, keeping the army in the barracks, a sense of inclusion everywhere. There were so many cleavages in India. The fear always was that, somehow these cleavages would kind of result in social disharmony, etc., etc. But I think the early founding fathers managed that, I must say, very well. It was not just that, the way I would put it is that it's not just, the striving and the maintenance of democracy, but I think the use of those values for creating a broader sense of kind of Hobbesian order, as it were, Hobbesian Huntingtonian order, which to some extent I think is a contrast with Pakistan. That order, both economic and political, has been a bit more elusive in Pakistan for a number of reasons that all of you know better, which also Atif alluded to at the very end. And I think creating that sense of broad order has been one of the lasting legacies. And in a way, we know from all the literature that unless you have order or a modicum of order, you don't really get investment and growth and innovation and so on. So I think those critical junctures led to some good choices which have stood India in good stead. But I think also, one shouldn't forget that, India did lag behind Pakistan for a long time. And those were, I think, also the result of some early choices, which, India paid the price for. I mean, we know that in the early years, especially between the mid-50s and 70s, agriculture in India lagged considerably behind. If you look at agricultural productivity, output, yields, India lags Pakistan for a long time. And so, the whole Lewisian transformation going from agriculture to manufacturing, with agriculture propelling the early stages, that did not happen to the same extent in India as it did in Pakistan. Then, of course, you had the whole license Raj, which lots of people like Jagdish Bhagwati, T.N. Srinivasan have written eloquently about. And also, let's not forget, Atif quoted these very striking numbers for Pakistan. I mean, India also neglected primary education for a long, long time. And even today, if you look at learning outcomes in India, they are not at all, fantastic. So I think those, ideology-driven statism, kind of ideology-driven neglect of agriculture, society making choices on education difficult. So I think those were some of the early, less good choices that India made. And we saw, of course, that the first 30 years, we had this relatively modest, moderate rate of growth, which, as you said, Hindu rate of growth, a per capita GDP of about 1.5%. Then, of course, crises happened. We had this major crisis in 66. The Green Revolution happened. Then, beginning in the 70s, agriculture starts doing well. And of course, politics comes in as well. What happens, Danny Roderick and I talk about the takeoff in the 1980s. It's in part, because politics changes. Mrs. Gandhi wants to become more pro-business. We call this, an era of pro-business reforms. So in the 80s, kind of growth takes off. It's also accompanied by macroeconomic instability. So the 80s growth happens, and then in some ways that precipitates the 1990 crisis. One can't actually therefore say engineer crises to get reforms, but that's what kind of sort of happens. And of course, ideas about the world change. I mean, there's no question that, when in the 90s, when, Indian policymakers turned around and said, wow, China has done so well. So kind of the turn to markets was partly crisis driven, but partly also the elites realized that, ideas about the world had changed. And so we had these, really terrific reforms in the 90s opening up. And India did for about, so between 1980 and about early 2010s, India had about 35 years of really, amazing growth, which really transformed India. Now, let's also not forget the role of accident. For example, the services revolution that happens in India beginning, the mid to late 1990s is partly also accident. India invests in higher education early on. The US opens up to immigration in the 60s. Indian engineers come to the US, they build a reputation, and then when the IT revolution happens, India is poised to kind of take advantage. So that's partly also a contingency that determines what happens. And so we have Hindu growth rate at about 35 years of about 6.5% growth rates. And then, of course, what happens is after the global financial crisis, the world heads south, but India heads south a bit more than the world. Because, and this is where I think, this is really in Atif's wheelhouse, we had the excesses. What happened in the 2000s, we had a boom in private investment growth, but also a boom in credit. And so there was a lot of, exuberance, bubbles. And when the global financial crisis happened, kind of, we had a classic, but unrecognized kind of, a slow crisis, a crisis of slow growth, which was basically because there was deleveraging after the global financial crisis. So in fact, since about 2011, 2012, I think growth in India has kind of faded off because of deleveraging. And of course, once again, we see the employment crisis emerging. Stigmatized capitalism has come back. So I think it's kind of a rich and varied story, which happens in phases, and it's determined by history, contingency, and the policy reforms. Policymakers get a lot of credit for actually, reversing some of the early mistakes that were made, and that also leads to a considerable revival of dynamism in the economy. So I think let me stop there and say that India faces a lot of challenges ahead. I think that, and we can do a deep dive into some of the other issues. But I just want to end by saying, on your last point, Sanjay, that it is interesting that I want to say that the turn to protectionism in India, this whole self-reliance in the last 4 or 5 years, which Soumitra Chatterjee and I have written about. I just want to say that it kind of reminds me of the Bourbons, about whom they said they not only remember nothing, they forget nothing. And I think in some ways, the turn back to protectionism is a bit of that, because we haven't remembered, or failed to internalize the fact, and this is one of the lesser known things about the Indian growth trajectory, that for 25 years between 1990 and 2010s, India was an East Asian tiger, not just in services, but in manufacturing. So 25 years of, gangbusters trade growth, which is what led to the 56% peak that you mentioned thing. But now somehow we don't seem to have remembered that. And of course, we haven't forgotten the memory of what happened under the earlier statist era as well. So I see this protectionism as somewhat, unfortunate, but really, policymakers, sometimes they remember nothing and forget nothing.
Thank you very much, Arvind, for that great sweep of 75 years of history. And I'm sure we're going to come back to this question of trade. So I will, leave it there for now. And last but not least, let me now turn to Ambassador Teresita Schaefer. Tacey, apart from the things that Michael mentioned, she's the author of India at the Global High Table, The Quest for Regional Primacy and Strategic Autonomy, which published with her husband, Howard Schaefer, as well as India in the 21st Century, Reinventing Partnerships. So, Tacey, how much has the economic performance of Pakistan and India influenced US policies towards and approaches towards these countries? So, what have been the different goals, focus areas, and success stories of the development partnership between US and Pakistan and India over the last 75 years?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to the Wilson Center. This is an intimidating panel to be a part of. But what I'm going to do is not give you really an economist's view of the economic dimensions of US relations with India and Pakistan, but more of a policy wonk's view. The short answer to your question is that until quite recently, India's and Pakistan's economic performance had relatively little impact on their relations with the United States. They were very much part of the picture, but not in the driver's seat. And what was in the driver's seat, as long as the Cold War was going on, was the Cold War. But it operated very differently in the case of the two countries. I will also take Pakistan first. Pakistan signed an alliance with the United States in 1953. This was part of John Foster Dulles' ring of alliances, basically against Soviet power. And that made the security relationship the dominant thread in US-Pakistan relations. Economic aid was also an important part of the picture, but as a means to an end. The US did want to help Pakistan build up its economy, but to a great extent, this was seen as an element of the security relationship. The big focus areas in the economic aid portfolio shifted. And I would argue that they shifted largely in response to changing views about what did and did not promote development, and inevitably, to some degree, in response to what was popular or unpopular in the US Congress, which had to appropriate the money. Until 1971, the biggest investments were in infrastructure, and these had huge political visibility. Tarbela in what is now Pakistan, and the Karnapuli Dam in what is now Bangladesh. The Karnapuli Dam was on the 5 rupee note. You talk about, you see these signs with clasped hands that are basically advertisement for the US aid relationship. You couldn't make up a better advertising campaign than putting it on a relatively small currency note. For the next decade or so, basic human needs were the most important element, and a substantial amount of that went into agriculture. And I would say that agriculture was one of the most successful areas, actually, in both countries. Later, AID's stated goals placed more stress on the nature of economic policies, in particular, developing market economies. And then agriculture, health, and food security came back. Scientific cooperation was also an important element, and I would say, again, one of the success stories. Some of this was agricultural science, some of it was health related. But the big ups and downs in US-Pakistan relations had to do with security. Wars with India in 1965 and 1970, interruptions in military supply, nuclear policy, which led to not one but 2 aid cutoffs, and the second one in 1990 lasted a decade. Afghanistan, which was in the driver's seat as a security issue from the Soviet invasion in 1979 until the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, and even beyond to a significant extent. 9/11, the attack on New York and Washington, led to a rapprochement, a renewal of the importance of Afghanistan, and a resumption of both economic and military aid. China didn't become an important security partner for Pakistan until the 1960s, and that in part because of the US cutoff of military supply in the 1965 war. Pakistan was looked at as a good economic performer in the early years, and as has already been mentioned, it outperformed India. The US bought into Mahbub ul-Haq's policy of what we would now call trickle-down economics, and was not particularly troubled by the large role of the 22 families. And Pakistan growth was quite strong in those years. As trickle-down looked less promising, Pakistan was basically not a big enough economic partner for the United States to have that drive the relationship. Shift gears to India, which of course did not join the alliance with the United States. It preferred non-alignment, and it developed a significant relationship with the United States, the Soviet Union, which supplied both aid and military equipment. India was ambivalent about US economic assistance. It arguably wanted the support, but it didn't want to ask for it, much less to see any impact of that aid on their foreign policy. The US aid program got off to a rough start. India did ask for help for the Bokaro steel mill. The United States said no, the Soviet Union said yes. Eventually, a large program started out and became one of the most visible aspects of the US-India relationship. The focus areas were not too different from Pakistan, though the scientific cooperation aspect was larger. Some of that has led a significant legacy. Smallpox eradication, which was successful in its goal, but unsuccessful in building a partnership relations. Polio eradication, which managed to learn from the lessons of smallpox eradication, and above all, the Green Revolution, which led to a long-standing relationship between the Indian Council of Agricultural Research and its American counterparts. The security relationship was practically non-existent in those days, with the notable exception of military supply during the 1962 war with China, which left surprisingly little lasting goodwill behind. India's economic performance, we've already heard, was sluggish. And I won't go into the reasons for that. I couldn't possibly compete with Advan's masterful presentation. That just added to the sense that India wasn't going anywhere, nor was its relationship with Washington. Late 1980s, growth had started to pick up. India had a brush with bankruptcy. This was fascinating as a picture of what was going on in Indian policymakers' heads. I remember having lunch with the then Indian executive director at the IMF not long before the upcoming election. And he said he was going back to Delhi. Oh, I said, why? And he said, I have to tell everybody very quietly, do not trash the IMF because you're about to need it really badly. And he was successful in keeping the IMF from being a big campaign issue, which would have complicated life afterward. But then came the era of economic reform, which conveniently enough more or less coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The reformers in India were convinced that the country could do better and made significant changes in economic policy, which, if I recall rightly, roughly tripled their trade to GDP ratio. And that produced growth rates that were multiples of what India had experienced before. This got the attention of the United States government and of business. Growth has had some hiccups, unemployment, volatility during COVID and after, return to the old DNA of protectionism. But the expectations are now that India can recover its momentum at some point. And the big surprise, the security relationship with Washington is now actually more of a driver of the relationship than economics. Economics has become important, and without India's economic turnaround, I do not think the India-US relationship would have reached the point where it is now. It's hard to have a serious relationship with the United States, especially if you're a large country like India, if you don't also have a serious economic relationship. But on the security side, we've developed a good security dialogue. We have similar concerns about China, which is clearly now India's major security challenge. Trade is contentious, and we can get to that later. And I think I will wind up now so that Sanjay can ask us more questions.
Thank you very much, Daisy, for going through, again, those very long periods and helping us understand them through the key factors that explain those shifts. So I will come back to you on trade, as you said, but let me now go back to Atif for a second round and ask, Atif, you did talk a lot about the rent seekers and the crony capitalists, but so my question is that is the combination of the trade protection and crony capitalism, is it too heavy a burden for Pakistan and its export sector? I mean, and then it leads to what you have written about as well, the recurrent balance of payments crises. And as I said earlier, there has been strong resort to protectionism to preserve scarce foreign exchange now in Pakistan. So how do you see this, and how do you see this evolving?
Sanjay, can I abuse my privilege to also ask Atif a question, which I'm dying to get his views on, if it's okay with you?
Sure.
Atif, also, in the course of answering this, something that I'd really, love for the audience to hear from you is, if you think about the broader political economy of Pakistan, and if you, I don't know whether you do or do not believe in the aid curse or whatever, do you think that some of that, what even Tezi spoke about, that early aid, military aid, somehow entrenching a political economy that was, problematic, and possible path dependence from that? How important do you think that story is in Pakistan? I'd love to hear from you as well.
Thank you both. Let me start with Arvind's question, and I'll try to weave in Sanjay's your question as well. And maybe I'll use this as an excuse to go back a little bit into history that I did not do early on. Let me be a bit contrarian, actually. Sanjay mentioned military, and Arvind mentioned military aid as well. And everyone knows that the size of the military relative to India, certainly in Pakistan's economy, is larger, and so on and so forth. But the key question is there kind of, how important is that as a causal or structural force in explaining Pakistan's trajectory? And that's where I have more of a contrarian view, in the sense that everyone seems to know the answer to that question, and I'm just a lot more agnostic about that. And I'll tell you why. If you just look at the US has a much higher military expenditure than Europe, even higher during the 60s and 70s, during the height of the Cold War. I don't know of anyone serious who has mentioned that as a handicap to the US growth rate as opposed to Europe, for example, that they were spending a lot more on the military. Similarly, on the development side, and then cross-country, I don't know if anyone has mentioned this. So I'm just, let's just look at data. I want a more scientific approach to this question. Another very useful example is Korea. Go back to General Park's era. And I went back once and I dug up, okay, what was their share of military expenditure during General Park's era? Certainly military was in control, right? So all of those things were, and Korea seems to have come out of that reasonably well, if not gangbusters by historical standards. So I just want to give a little bit of pause. I think we are a bit too quick to judgment on these kind of issues. Life is, as we know, a lot more complicated than that. So I don't think it's as simple as that. Let's cut military budget in half and things will be hunky-dory. Not at all. So I just want to, because it's a very serious question, and I think we need to bring that seriousness back in understanding sort of the details. So that's point number one I want to make. Point number two, on the political economy aspect of things, is, and this will come back to like the political elite and sort of how to understand trajectory and so on. Erwin very rightly talked about path dependency and the importance of early kind of endowment or early shocks. And I think the most important shock from that perspective for Pakistan is the asymmetry of partition. It's very important to understand that. With Prashant Bharadwaj and Asim Khwaja, we once did a project using census data from the 30s and 40s and comparing it to post-partition. What is remarkable is, and Sanjay mentioned that, as a share of the population, what Pakistan experienced in terms of in-migration flows was just extraordinary. You look at the proportion of population that has just moved in over a period of 2-3 years in major urban centers, especially in West Pakistan at the time. It's just, how does a society grapple with that? But that's not important in my view, not the size. What is important is the characteristics associated with that very large size. And that's very important. The educational elite among the Muslims was actually a large share of it was actually settled in where Muslims were in minority in India. That's a very, people don't often talk about it. And so it's not just the number of people were large in magnitude that moved into Pakistan. They were also highly educated relative to the average Pakistani population, number one. And number two, something else was happening, which is the Hindus living in West Pakistan that obviously migrated out mostly, they were also a lot more educated in what was West Pakistan. So there was a vacuum being left by the sort of the at some level a significant sort of dominant class politically and economically, and that vacuum was naturally going to be filled in with that incoming more educated Muslim class coming from what was United India before partition. And that has had very important structural, and then they formed political alliances, and obviously military was useful in forming those. So I think it's not just like, okay, let's blame the military and so on. There's a political class that gets entrenched, which is very different than the political class of like the Nehru dynasty. The Nehru dynasty could live off of a democratic predisposition because they had their connections and they knew they would win elections. The in-migrant Muslim aristocracy, if you will, could not win elections because they were just, they were coming to these areas in the first place. So elections did not suit them. Otherwise, they were as whatever after their interest as Nehru was looking after his interest. It's not that one was more nationalistic in spirit. I think it's just the self-interest benefited the broader Indian interest more at the time than in the Pakistan case, perhaps. So that's how I want to look at the situation. And I don't want to simplify it in that, okay, just about military expenditure and let's blame the generals and so on. It's not as simple as that. I think that's very important to understand. The other point I'll make is, again, in that counterfactual world of the political elite in Pakistan, it's very important to understand that the sort of the most important player was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Why? Because he was the one person he had the political skills and so on, and it was his vote bank and no one else's, so to speak. There's no one else in that league in Pakistan historically. Imran Khan perhaps comes closest in more recent times as kind of a person-specific vote bank, if you will. But unfortunately, in Bhutto's case, if you look at what he did with that power, it's very interesting. It's not clear he was any less autocratic than how a military dictator would be in how he used it and what kind of changes he brought about socially, politically, and constitutionally, and how he acted and reacted to the events. It wasn't very democratic, if you will, in terms of his attitude. And one can go into those details, but I'll just leave it at that the counterfactual of military stepping back and the political elite coming in, it's not clear that will be any better for those broader things. And then let me just give one last kind of analogy. And no, but I see some of that similarity now in India with Modi and the way he is responding to his sort of political opposition and so on. It's not clear, right? While India does not have a strong military, but it's moving in a more autocratic direction. I don't think there are any two views about that for any objective observer. And so I really fear what that is going to bring in India and for the region. And that's something we have to be. So again, I just want to do the broad thing that I don't, because otherwise I don't want to just label people as just fundamentally good or bad. I think we need to understand the broader context. Now, in that broader context, how important is aid and so on? I think what has happened, and this is sort of the way I would connect Sanjay's question with Arvind's. What has happened over time is that because, go back to my main thing, the elite is not just rent-seeking elite, they always are. Everywhere around the world, they try to rent-seek, but it's in a particularly unproductive dimension. A consequence of that unproductive dimension is that you're going to have serious balance of payment problems, because your demand for foreign goods is driven by unproductive sources. So you will never be able to balance your budget, so to speak, externally, because you don't have that much to sell to the rest of the world. You're just not productive enough to sell them the high value added cars and so on and so forth. So in that situation, it's always a very convenient partnership to get aid from an external source. That's the way you want to look at it. And it's true whether the leadership is military or whether the leadership is civilian. Again, it's not about that. And that is what has happened over time in Pakistan, that they have always gone out seeking, because they don't want to solve that structural problem by taking the hard medicine. They want to kick the can down the road And so they've always looked for quote unquote strategic partnerships by using world events of the time, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's now China, whether it's Saudi Arabia, and so on. And Pakistan's political elite have always sought those partnerships to gain that sort of foreign exchange for non-economic reasons, to actually satisfy the structural economic imbalance that Pakistan faces externally vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That's the way you want to look at the situation to understand why Pakistan not just has relied on it, but has actually repeatedly sought. It's very interesting. Every new government, look at their first foreign trips where they go. They don't go to countries necessarily where Pakistan has the most to gain in terms of economic productivity and so on. It's always where they can get the quickest check. And now, obviously, things, IMF is an important player in that, so that's where we are these days. And historically, that's where Pakistan has been as well. So I hope that was useful in sort of developing a broader framework for thinking about these issues.
Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought, Atif, and obviously many questions, but I will not go into those for want of time. So, Arvind, perhaps I will turn back to you, and perhaps relatively quickly, if you could answer one major issue that troubles everybody who thinks about Indian development, is the persistence of high unemployment, right? Despite all the years of those gangbusters growth that you talked about, and the if you can link it also to the reversion, why has there been this, as you have written about, the reversion to trade protection, despite all the evidence, India's own experience and all of that. So if you could get to that, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. And thanks, Atif, for that terrific clarification of the political economy. I think, Sanjay, at one level, the answer to your question is sort of not too complicated. Is that in my view, in the last post-global financial crisis, the problem of employment opportunities, etc., have resurfaced for the simple reason that the economy has slowed down considerably, relative to the global financial crisis years. And so the puzzle is only a big puzzle. It is somewhat of a puzzle, but it's only a very big puzzle if you think actually growth was great and why weren't the employment opportunities created. Post-global financial crisis, the economy has slowed down considerably. And manifests, every indicator that you can think of: credit, private investment, profits, tax collections. They've just, all the trade. All these things used to be in the double to high double digits. They're in the low single digits. So that's one. The second, I think, is that in the boom period, your employment opportunities were actually driven by kind of three sectors. Not only did you have a boom, you had a boom which affected agriculture. You had a boom in construction, both of which were very labor intensive, and so employment opportunities did well. And of course, you had this boom also in services, which was more skill biased rather than thing. But the combination of those three things meant you had both the dynamism and the employment creation. But what's happened in the last few years, of course, post-global financial crisis, the dynamism has kind of ebbed away. Construction has basically, until very recently, also slowed down considerably. Agriculture was buffeted by, shocks and things. And as the world economy turned down, for a long time, services growth also, I think that's why, a share of services to GDP was also declined considerably after the global financial crisis. So I think that it's sort of not inconsistent in terms of what happened before and what happened, for the 20-25 years before and what happened afterwards. And that's why you see, I think that, and a sign of the fact that, employment has not done as well, post-COVID, if you look at the claims on the, Manrega, the employment guarantee scheme, remain very, very high. You see even today a lot of the unrest over the most recent announcement on this Agnipath, etc., reflect a broader problem of lack of employment opportunities, especially, and this is kind of a way of thinking about it, right? That demographically, I mean, again, I'm caricaturing and being reductive. There are two Indias. The heartland, which is still on the upswing of the demographic dividend, and kind of peninsular India, which has started to, fertility is below replacement, labor force growth is slowing down. But it is in the heartland where, demography is still very strong, labor force growth is very strong, is where the employment opportunities are weakest. And then what happens is, in the boom era, what happened was, migration was very high, and everyone was willing to have and encourage this migration within India. But as the economy has slowed down, and as there's been a sense that it's a zero-sum game, that once more affirmative action reservations have come to the surface. Once again, states are saying jobs for locals. So in a sense, you have this combination of slowing growth, of a pattern of growth which is not as employment creating. You have demography, and you have politics all interacting to make the employment situation probably a little more difficult than is palatable to manage at this stage. So this is something that I think India has to get to grips with quite soon.
Okay. So thank you very much, Arvind. Let me go back once more to Tesi. And the question on trade, right? So we said we'd get back to it. And I was wondering that, for both India and Pakistan, the US is the largest market by far, right? For exports of goods and services. But and yet, as I mentioned, both Pakistan and India have seen growing protection. The two speakers have also talked about that. This must feature, right, in conversations between US officials and Indian counterparts. What do you see? Is there any scope for constructive engagement between counterparts in the US and India and Pakistan to reduce their trade barriers and in a sense for their own future and to secure their place in global supply chains and so on? Has there been any constructive possibility there?
Well, yes, but it's not terribly encouraging at the moment. With the US and Pakistan, there has been for some years now a quest for a new big issue in the relationship. Pakistan is frankly sick and tired of having Afghanistan be the main issue in their relationship with Washington. So, and the security relationship is complicated. So how about building up the economic relationship? And this is something that gets a lot of enthusiasm in theory from the US government. The difficulty is those American investors that are already in Pakistan have made their peace with the situation, however it happens to affect them. They're not going anywhere. But it's very difficult to persuade new investors to come in because what they read about is trouble in various ways. So it seems like trying to create something out of not much. I think in a lot of ways this is unfair. I think that it would have a lot of good effects if you could get an increase in trade and an increase in investment going. But ultimately what that will take is some diversification of what Pakistan produces, A high percentage of their exports to the United States are ready-made garments. And a decrease in the anxiety of businesses sticking their toe in the Pakistani pond. With respect to India, there have been serious discussions going on for ages. The thing that is really striking is how little has changed in the agenda of our trade dialogue. So many issues are ones that I remember from when I was in government. And it's now 30 years since I left my last job in Washington, my last South Asia related job in Washington. And we still natter about intellectual property. It's not as toxic as it used to be, but it's not resolved. There are issues on various specific exports from the United States. There are some arcane issues with dairy exports, which looked as if they were almost resolved, but they are now back to not being resolved. And to that one is now adding issues in the cyber area, data management, and so on. India is still working on passing a new law on data privacy. At least its name is data privacy, but it's not clear to me whether it's enhanced data privacy or enhanced Indian government control over data. When it gets into a contest between those two, the Indian government usually wins. So this is a difficult area of discussion. I think it's important to keep trying because I think this is, again, a way of building in greater depth in the relationship and doing some things that will, at the end of the day, almost certainly help accelerate India's economic growth, even though it doesn't necessarily feel that way if you are sitting on the seat of the Indian finance minister. Let me just say two things in response to things I heard in this third round. The 22 families in Pakistan, haven't some of them also been among those who actually brought about the increase in manufacturing in Pakistan? Now, that increase in manufacturing very much needs to be diversified, but you don't want it not to exist. The migration of the educated between India and Pakistan. In Pakistan, that had a huge impact on the political economy because in the early days, the Muhajirs, those who had come from the Muslim minority parts of India, were a very important ethnic political group. They're still referred to as Urdu speakers, in spite of the fact that Urdu is more or less the lingua franca in Pakistan. On the Indian side, there's an interesting disconnect in the way people look at Modi's, or looked when he was first coming into office, at Modi's impact on the economy. They saw Gujarat as an economic success story, therefore, India will become an even bigger economic success story. The business community in particular saw Modi as very pro-business. What they didn't realize was that he was really pro-Indian business and not necessarily to the same degree pro-international business. So that some of the difficulties we've had on the investment account are very much still with us. And it's doesn't go by the name of protectionism, but it's the same instinct. And it's the same political economy. I mean, the Indian business community got very much more into the lobbying game in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. than they had been before. And so that makes it very hard to give up protectionism. And India is not unique this way. They're not the only country in which businesses say, oh, yes, definitely open up the market, but just not my sector, please.
Sanjay, can I just, I want to say a couple of things. May I?
Sure, go ahead. Quickly, if you can.
Yeah. On the trade, and I don't know about US Pakistan, but on US India, let me say a couple of things that, while, both India and Pakistan are turning protectionist, no question about it. But I think let's also be clear for the record that
the US is too, if that was what
I mean, the US is now completely incapable of negotiating trade agreements, whatever the domestic politics, and that's why even in a broader context, people have said, the US is now going into the international engagement game, with one hand tied behind its back because it just can't do anything on trade. So that shouldn't be forgotten as well when we think about this. The second thing to say about India and this is that in the last few months, there has been a slightly encouraging trend, Sanjay, in that India has started, negotiating free trade agreements. It's done one with the UAE, with Australia, and now it has started discussions with the European Union. So there is a sense in which India is trying to maybe a little bit claw back on the self-reliance by trying to negotiate these. And what's interesting is that the US is not on that agenda of negotiating these free trade agreements. I mean, I don't know where they'll head, but at least there's a sign that an effort to try and become more open, even if selectively and preferentially.
Yes, we all I think get frustrated about the trade position and the stance on the TPP and so on. But let me turn now to audience questions, because we don't have much time left for them. Do want to give some space to that. So let me start with the questions. So Michael has been passing on some questions to me. And the first one will be for Atif, I guess, which is, has Pakistan ever made it to a real economic plan and policies in the last 75 years? Do we have any implementable solution, considering the country's elite is not going to compromise on their interests at all, which has led to rent-seeking? Do you think Manmohan's economic formula in India can be adapted in Pakistan as well? And I'm going to tag on another question, since it's also to you. Can CPEC contribute to end the economic crisis in Pakistan? So to you, Atif.
Yeah, so I don't think it's as simple as just, sometimes people have this notion that you write down a plan or a framework on a piece of paper, and this is sort of press a button and everything will be hunky-dory. Or one specific thing, be it CPEC or anything else, is going to be the silver bullet that solves this issue. Or to be so pessimistic to say the elite are never going to give up power, so what can be, there's no hope. That's not how I view the world. You have to look at sort of a move from one equilibrium to a more productive one, a more positive one, and think about the conditions that will lead the country in that direction. And so I always remain optimistic, because we have seen those transitions happen historically. And by the way, the world over large has never been as well off economically and in terms of standard of living in the past. I think from a long run view, there's a lot of optimism that we need to have. So with that premise, in my view, going forward, as we talk about plans and reforms, the way I potentially see it happening is that there has to be a new, I'm going to use a technical word like Coasian bargaining between the major political actors. What I mean by that is that the nodes of power have to somehow at some point come together to form a new rules of the game going forward. That's what Pakistan really needs, is like these new rules of the game. And you can see they're really struggling right now. It's, for example, we talked about the military versus the rest and so on. The issue with Pakistan right now is, or one of the issues is that nobody is in full control actually. And that's one of the problems. And for that reason, they can't credibly promise long-run reforms. In fact, no actor can currently in Pakistan. The military does not have full control. Even Imran Khan, that was supposed to be sort of the military person coming in, now is openly against them. And that's the reality of, and others have been historically as well. So that's the reality of the situation, that it's actually very much in the flux. I think people underestimate how much things are in the flux politically. And I would not be surprised at all if in a relatively short period of time, Pakistan moves to a much better equilibrium going forward. It could take a long time, or it could take, as the change happens very slowly and until it doesn't, right? And so I think that process is very much, people are aware that it's not working. Like even the elite are aware that, this, you can't milk this too much more. And you can see it with the IMF pressures right now. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to kind of dive into like a Sri Lanka kind of situation, or how do you get out of it? So they know things, the status quo is not working. It will not work. And I think there's going to be this, that's nature's way of pushing a society towards change. And Pakistan is very much being pushed in that direction. I mean, the same is true for the level of violence that Pakistani society has experienced over the last. I think people underappreciate what it has done to people and to their attitudes and and to the sort of this desire to get out of it. So it's those pressures that actually make me optimistic. Fundamental reforms are needed. This is not, I don't have the time to kind of really dive into it. I could spell those out. It's not about CPEC is good or bad. It's about knowing what to ask for the economy to get from something like CPEC. I think that's where the flaws have been. That Pakistanis haven't really figured out what is it that is of first order importance to gain productivity going forward. It's that stuff that you need to get out of trade agreements or other agreements like CPEC. They're all agreements. None of them are good or bad fundamentally. It's how you structure them that's important. So let's not be too simplistic to say, okay, CPEC is good or evil. It's the details that matter. Sanjay, if you just allow me 2 minutes, I just wanted to talk about one other issue that we haven't talked about, which is, you've talked about India and you've talked about Pakistan. We haven't really talked about India and Pakistan. And I just want to say, as a citizen of South Asia, I just want to say a few things on that, which I'm quite alarmed about, actually. And I just want to give voice to that. So I have never been as alarmed about India and Pakistan as I am now, because we seem to be institutionalizing polarization between the two countries. There is so much heightened animosity for each other at a public social level, which I think is very dangerous for the region. And we need to recognize that, and we need to do something about that. There is great value in somehow coming together as people and thinking about the common good as well. Of course, we should always think about our respective national objectives. It is our duty to do that as respective citizens. But we seem to have completely forgotten that there is also at the same time a common good and a need for the countries and the people to come together. We are not doing anything to go in that direction. And everything is happening that is making us more polarized, making us move further, and making it more and more difficult to solve kind of the collective issues. Let us not forget that the partition happened because there was a fundamental commitment problem, that the populations could not commit each other politically. I mean, that's sort of what was the root of it. And we are doubling down on that structural issue by not being able to resolve our common problems. And again, just pretending that we can live on these separate islands. You can't. There is just, you can't avoid borders, the common history, the common culture. And why should we? We have a lot to gain from coming together. Someone said that on the internet. I'll just end on that. I only have one policy proposal, perhaps, which is, someone said, can we at least, people born on the other side of the border, but then they had to move, now they are at least 75-year-old, right? Can we at least have a program where we say, okay, every year we'll give, 1,000 visas to such people who can just travel across the border? and visit their town of birth, just as a gesture of goodwill. They're too old to do anything now anyways. Just as a gesture of goodwill. Can we? And you know what? It's a non-starter politically on both sides of the border. That's just how bad the situation has become. And I'll just end on that note that it needs to change as well. And I think that needs to be part of the public discourse as well, for the people to try and come together at some level at least.
Yeah, you couldn't have said a truer word. And as you know, this is the stuff that I actually am engaged in. But we will leave that for another seminar, but perhaps you can see it. Because there are still a lot of questions coming up for you. But thank you for those thoughts, Atif. So let me turn to, there are two questions, and one will be for, so let me start with Arvind. Yeah. So the India-Pakistan relationship impacts the entire region. Sri Lanka is in crisis and now heading to IMF support. Many other nations in India's immediate periphery are in economic and political distress. Now, this actually question gets a little bit to Atif, to what he said at the end. How do you see India and Pakistan contributing for regional stability and an important and absent ingredient in the region? And in the interest of time, I'm going to read out another question, which I think both Arvind and Atif you could think about. And this is from Michael, actually. And he says, what are the most promising growth sectors in both countries, especially as India and Pakistan continue their urbanization trend? Also, Bangladesh has had some of the most robust growth in South Asia in recent years. Does it offer any lessons for India and Pakistan moving forward? So, Arvind, first to you, and then I will also come back to Tezi.
Can I take them in reverse order, Sanjay, please? Because the thing about the lessons for Bangladesh, I do think that if you look around the world economy, I mean, one kind of, I don't know whether to call it optimism, but certainly an opportunity has arisen for a number of developing countries like India and Pakistan, which has, it also kind of relates a bit to what Tezi was saying about Pakistan and manufacturing, is that, as China started getting richer, it was vacating export space. Now there's a kind of second globalization shock where, capital is also slowly exiting China. Now, it seems to me that if you put both of those together, there is a kind of a series of opportunities that are being created for potential low-income countries that can do manufacturing to fill in the space vacated by China. We know that Vietnam and closer to the neighborhood, Bangladesh have taken advantage of that opportunity, and that's why we see of course in Bangladesh it's mostly clothing and textiles, but in Vietnam it's kind of across the board. But by definition, Bangladesh and Vietnam cannot fill the entire space vacated by China, and that's where I think lots of opportunities arise, both for India and Pakistan, provided they're able to take advantage of that. So that would be my kind of partial response to what Michael asked for, Michael's question. I mean, on the first question, I think that the honest answer is, let me just echo the pessimism of Atif. Honestly, I don't know what the solution is, because someone either it was one of India's either Pratap Mehta or Ram Guha made the point that in not just in India and Pakistan, but if you look at Sri Lanka and also some extent Bangladesh, but also Myanmar, I think the whole polarization story is kind of getting worse and across the region. And I think the point made is that, and I guess this is what Atif also had in mind, that polarization in one part of South Asia kind of makes polarization more likely and more difficult to manage in other parts of the neighborhood. So that's the sense in which I think that. But what is to be done? I mean, I think I frankly, given the underlying political situation around the region, I don't know how we get out of it. And to be honest, I don't have any, even half decent solutions to offer.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you very much, Arvind. So we are getting to the last 5 minutes of our session, and there are still many questions. So I will have to unfortunately pass on some of the more recent questions that came. But Tesi, if I may turn to you for the last question before the final round, is that this same question, do you think there are any prospects, in a sense, looking at it from the outside, if you like, are there any prospects for the region to work more closely together and taking some advantage of some of the opportunities that Arvind mentioned, of the space that China is vacating, either separately or hopefully even together, working together in regional and global supply chains, and providing some stability to the region that is being by Sri Lanka, Pakistan, can India and Bangladesh, can the region work together to provide some stability to itself, as East Asia tends to do?
I'm going to start with a basic.
But sorry, you will have just 1 minute.
Okay.
Sorry.
When you think about making supply chains more reliable, that does not mean simply making everything at home. It means diversifying and making them more resilient. If you take this as the guideline, then there are possibilities. The easiest ones would involve India and somebody else other than Pakistan. But that would miss an important element. I would much prefer to see something involving India and Pakistan, but that would have to be private. I think the chances of those two governments agreeing to something like that are very poor, unfortunately. And I think that has us run out of time.
Yeah.
This was one discussion I would have loved to continue.
Yeah. Maybe we will continue this in another session, but I'd like to now close with a final round of questions to each of you. And in the interest of time, I will just say them together and just turn to each of you. So in reverse order, I'm going to go. So in Tesi, what is one factor that makes you optimistic about US policy having a benign influence on the future of India and Pakistan? And one factor that makes you pessimistic, right? So that's the question for you, Tesi. For Atif, what is one thing that makes you hopeful about the future of Pakistan, and one thing that makes you gloomy and despondent? And Arvind, exactly the same question for you with respect to India. So you'll have just, about 1 minute each as we reach 11:30. So Tesi, first to you.
What makes me hopeful is that there is in the United States at this moment a government that truly wants to expand cooperation. And that means that there isn't a sort of reflexive no waiting for you. What makes me gloomy is the state of US politics and the difficulty of getting anything serious agreed to. I'm watching this gun safety legislation with some trepidation. Even if they succeed, it will be a pretty small thing.
Thank you very much, Tesi. Atif?
On the optimism side, one change in Pakistan is what the women have been doing, especially the younger women in Pakistan over time. Their level of education relative to men, they've really closed the gap and in fact exceeded men. And obviously, that's half of the population and all of that. that's an incredible resource. If it could be, I talked about low labor, female labor participation. If that resource could somehow get integrated into the society, the political, economic, social fabric by empowering them in the usual ways, that can really change the future of Pakistan. I think that's an incredible raw material that's there, but it's currently is a glass ceiling of various sorts. Pessimism is the flip side of it, which is, I think if the elite could only recognize that there are these bubbling positive pressures, and if they could just open the dams, so to speak, or the floodgates, to let them proceed in that positive direction. That's the pessimism, is if the elite power structures, would they allow those positive forces to move naturally, to take Pakistan to a higher level? And so that's the sort of the despondency, if you will, that will there be change that finally brings about more equality, more willingness to open up the society? Will we go in that direction or not? That's kind of the big question mark in mind.
Thank you. Arvind?
No, I think that Keynes, I think, said that the mistake we make, looking at the future, is to kind of extrapolate the recent past, and I think that there's a lot about the present to be despondent about, and as Atif and you and others have mentioned, the polarization in the region in all countries, I think, is. But as Macmillan said, Harold Macmillan, events, dear boy, events. Stuff happens, things change, shocks happen. Anything could happen, and I think in the case of India, it's still kind of vast enough and kind of different enough for both excesses of pessimism and optimism to be, I think, tempered and checked. There's a lot of dynamism in parts of the country. There's a lot of yearning still for harmony all over the place. Stuff happens. A large country with heterogeneity is going to hopefully keep some of the worst excesses in check, and then we muddle along.
Okay, so you kind of took the middle road on that one. So I have the pleasant duty of closing this, but unfortunately we couldn't continue. We will try to see if we can engineer something again. But I have to thank you, Atif. You actually echoed in my class on Pakistan when I teach a course on South Asia, and when I sort of posed to myself, what is it that makes me most optimistic about Pakistan, about its future? I talk exactly about women and educated women and their future, and empowering them for a role in society. So thank you for that. And I want to say one other thing is that on purely in an instrumental sense, Atif, Arvind talked about the sort of, the moral case for, regional working with each other, reducing and eliminating polarization. But even in a purely instrumental sense, India is the largest missing market for Pakistan by far, in gravity modeling and all that comes out very clearly. And the Pakistani market is no small shakes either. Like, we did a study a couple of years ago in the World Bank when I was there, that we said both countries could export goods of $18 billion of each other. At its peak, the trade was $2 billion, at least a formal part of the trade. So there is a lot of promise, and that can lead to many other things that the positive forces that Desi also talked about. So with that, let me thank Ambassador Schaefer, Professor Atif Mia, Professor Arvind Subramanian for taking the time, for giving us this brilliant and thoughtful perspectives that they shared, and to Michael and the Wilson Center for hosting this. So thank you. and have a good day wherever you are in whichever part of the world. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thanks, Atif and Tazia. Thanks a lot.